I call the Public Safety and Homeless Committee meeting to order. Let's go around the table and have people introduce themselves. Start with John.
John Weddleton. Felix Rivera.
Fred Dyson.
I'm Simon Trainee, representing my husband, Dick Trainee.
Forrest Dunbar.
I'm Pete Peterson, representing myself.
All right. Like the police officers introduce themselves, and anybody that's here that's representing a relevant organization, introduce yourselves, please.
Jack Carson, Anchorage Place.
I'm sorry, say it louder.
Jack Carson, the Anchorage Place.
Captain Mike Curl with the Anchorage Police Department. Ken McCoy, Deputy Chief of Police.
Oh, and Chief Dahl.
Justin Dolly, PD.
All right, thank you. The way I hope for this to go this morning is I'm going to hand the gavel over to Mr. Rivera and for the portion having to do with the homeless and the law, police response to that, and hope to be done by 35 after the hour. I'd like to take 10 minutes to talk in general about an ordinance we're considering that criminalizes the reckless transmission of infectious diseases. Just a draft conversation, brainstorming, if you will. I'll have questions here that I'm asking and want to add to that. And then have time, hopefully that'll take about 10 minutes, and then have more time for public input. And with that, I'll hand the gavel to Mr. Rivera.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Under new business, the A, I just have 3 subjects I wanted to...
excuse me. Suzanne has joined us.
Yes, thank you. There are 3 subjects I wanted to discuss with APD.
Yes. Rivera, before we get started, do you, does the body have an interest in getting a brief update on the incident at Denali Elementary this morning?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So about 9:31 this morning, the department got a report of a shooting at Denali Elementary School. Our officers were on scene in under 2 minutes, about 90 seconds. And the investigation so far makes it appear that there were 2 people that were in the parking lot of the school. They got involved in an altercation, and one person produced a gun and shot the other one. That person, the suspect, is in custody, being interviewed by officers. We have contact with the victim, who's been transported to a hospital. Obviously, we've been closely coordinating with the school district. I believe they followed their protocols and put the school in lockdown. We had officers there very, very rapidly. It was a combination of off-duty officers in their take-home cars, patrol officers, I think a traffic officer or 2, and school resource officers. We were able to, establish the security of the school, clear the school, make sure everything was safe. The thing that I've been working with our community relations unit, and I myself went to the scene and talked to media, but the thing we've been reinforcing with the community is that nobody inside the school was injured, nobody inside the school was at risk, the suspect never went into the school, the incident doesn't appear to be related or targeting the school specifically, it just happened on school grounds. We had an appropriate and very rapid response, and we're able to establish control of it very, very quickly. So that's kind of the short version of what's going on.
Thank you. Any questions for the chief on that? Sure, Mr. Dyson.
I'm sorry, I was distracted. Do you have the suspects in custody?
Yes. Yep.
And they had weapons?
Yeah, there was a firearm involved. Yeah.
Can you tell us what kind?
As a handgun, I don't know.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Dunbar.
Is there any information about what the altercation was about? Was it parents or was it a drug deal?
It's a domestic dispute of some kind. And I think I know, but I'm waiting to hear the real info from detectives and so forth. But it was people that knew each other previously, had some sort of domestic dispute.
And it was unrelated to the school then?
Correct. Yep.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
That's okay. That's why I wanted to bring it up as the answer question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, let the record reflect that Mr. Constant has joined us. All right. Thank you so much for your swift response this morning. So moving on in our agenda to APD report on homelessness efforts. There are 3 particular items that I wanted to discuss that I think are much better discussed in this venue versus my committee. First is regarding bike chop shops. Second is regarding warrants in camps. And then third is regarding sexual assaults and other crimes committed in camps and what we're hearing, what we're doing. So if you want to take those in any order.
Sure. So with regards to bike chop shops, you know, or frankly any other illegal or apparent illegal activity in the camps, whenever the community policing team or frankly patrol officers have contact with people who are camping illegally, you know, if criminal activity is identified, they take action. Seeing a large stack of bicycle parts, I think most people would go and look and say, well, that probably doesn't look right, but that's not something that's immediately criminal. And it can be a challenge to prove that, you know, who those items are associated with, how they got there, whether or not there's some sort of criminal activity occurring, and putting a criminal case together. But that is something that we look into, you know, whenever we have occasion to be there in the normal course of the meeting.
Thank you. I just want the record reflect that Ms. Dombowski has joined us. And Mr. Constant, did you have a question?
No, actually, I just on the point of the bike chop shops have, working with the administration, drafted or with the legal office, legal department, drafted a draft ordinance to require the registration of bikes through the National Bike Registry, and also to create a penalty for having bikes that don't have that have the serial number scraped off in some manner. And so that should be starting to circulate to the public. It's been handed to the bike advocacy groups, and I'm waiting for their comments before that's published. It's coming.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dyson and then Mr. Peterson.
Yeah. I would encourage you to talk to the retailers, particularly the big box ones. The high-end bike shops, most of those, you know, they'll take care of that. And as I was talking to some of your officers, really tough to prove a crime because the bikes aren't registered. Somebody said I got it out of a dumpster, and it's my hobby. Buzz off. So, anyways.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Peters. Go ahead. I was going to say, even if they were, this might be more appropriate from when that ordinance comes forward, but even if they were registered, we might be able to show that they are, you know, the property of someone else and take them, but how would you still prove the crime? How would you prove that they were the ones that stole it versus some, you know, maybe they purchased it or received it from someone else that had stolen it?
Yeah, you know, these are legal questions for down the road, but I think that at some point being in the possession of stolen goods, in particular if you have a number of stolen items in your possession from a variety of other properties, would provide a preponderance of evidence. But again, we'll come to that down the road. You know, if you have 5 stolen bikes, you
Sure.
say I got them all out of the dumpster.
Well, since we have the chief of police here, I mean, do we have laws that are structured in that way where we can't prove that you stole it, but somewhere down the line you came in possession of the stolen goods?
Yes, so that's a great question, and you're right, that can be a challenge. Being in possession of stolen property is a crime, but there can be some hurdles to proving that you knew or should have reasonably known that it was stolen, things like that.
So what is the mens rea on those crimes?
I think the mens rea for that one is knowingly, and so it's a fairly high hurdle from a legal perspective to prove. Now, I think recently, if I'm not mistaken, we changed some municipal code with regards to stolen vehicles to
Right.
lower the mens rea
Reckless.
and make that a little easier to prove. So if you were considering an ordinance along those lines, that might be something that you think about to make it so it is a little bit more reasonable. Because I think that whoever made the point about coming across like 4 or 5 or 6,
Right.
stolen bikes, and then the excuses become a little more thin. The other challenge there will also be all the parts associated, because the frame is the part with the serial number, and so all the parts can be a little bit difficult. and would be difficult to regulate. But the frame is the most important part, obviously, because that's what you attach all the parts to. So having that ability, I think, probably wouldn't be a bad thing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Peterson and Mr. Dyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so I was going to ask Mr. Constant if is there a cost for this registration?
Nope, it's free. In fact, 10 years ago, if I might, there was a registration system that was a fee-based system that was abolished here. The technology has evolved, and it's simple. It's on your phone. You take a picture of the serial number and the bike. You put your contact information, and it's uploaded. The bike stores can do it. The individuals can do it. If your bike gets stolen, it can send a report out to people in radius that says, "Hey, my bike's been stolen. Look out for this bike." It's a pretty cool and very effective system.
So is it simple enough for
Yes.
the young people to use? I mean, because a lot of the bikes that get stolen seem to be children's bikes too.
I would say if you have a phone, if you're a parent, you have access to that tool at your fingertips. Otherwise, it's online. And still, just the way I approach it is along the lines, philosophically, along the lines of immunization. At some point, you get enough bikes registered, you have herd immunity from theft, we're going to start catching bike thieves. But until such time, it's going to be around 2% or less.
Can you,
Thank you.
may I ask a question?
Thank you. Sure, follow up and then Mr. Dyson.
This is actually of Chris, though. Can you, by serial number, search through that? So, for example, if you found a bike, and could you take the serial number, find it, and then find the owner? Well, okay, that's a great way then to prove that someone should have known this was a stolen good, right? So that really helps.
And you'll be required, if you're in possession of a bike, to register it.
Right.
And so if you didn't register it, then, and you have a stolen bike, there's even more effective kind of triangulation to the point of knowing. But I agree with you, and we'll probably get to change so it's more reckless than knowing. Should have known. I don't know what the standards are. That's what I have to determine.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Constant. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, I guess we're getting hung up on this one. I'll bet small potatoes compared to the dollar value of other things. Have you got any hint of where the market for these stolen bikes are? If anybody's selling them, like a real motorcycle chop shop?
I'm going to look at Lieutenant Carson for a second. I think I know the answer to that. The stolen bikes typically get traded around and traded for food, traded for drugs, traded for other things.
All right, that's enough. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Dyson. And I apologize. I think we interrupted you. Did you have anything else to report, Chief?
On that particular?
No.
I don't think so.
Okay. I did have one question. So is the new zone abatement, is that helping deter any of these shops? Or is it helping in any way with cleaning up these shops? Or
Come on up here. I'm going to let Lieutenant Carson answer because he's been actually directly involved in that, and I think can probably give some finer detail. I suspect the answer is going to be yes. But
The chief was going to save you from having to come up. Yes, it does. We had the cleanup over at Westchester where we gave them a 72-hour notice. They were extremely surprised by the time we returned, and we were able to seize most of that property. Even going through there, again, we weren't able to prove any of the items were stolen there. We created any cases out of it, but we were able to remove that large sum of bikes and bike parts and things like that. So yes, it has been effective. We actually got slotted. We got 2 more camps that have been identified by the public as kind of criminal camps. And those are actually slotted. We're going to 72-hour close those in the week of the 16th, I believe, is what we're trying to get out there. It's one of our goals before the end of the year, and cleanup completely shuts down, is we want to be able to hit anything that's been identified as like a criminal camp and get those cleaned up and done before winter hits.
Thank you. Any questions on that? Okay, Mr. Constant, and then before, I just want to let the record reflect that Ms. Clint Davidson has joined us. Go ahead.
So what I understand from RADA is that camp cleanup doesn't actually stop, that it just becomes severely curtailed for lack of staffing and because of environmental challenges.
It's yes and no. The weather does affect it. When items start freezing into the ground, they do stop the cleanup. But all the way until that point, the main personnel that's been hired for the summertime are off. So now we're really limited. I think they're down to about 4 or 5 people, and they also have many other duties. We are continuing to clean up until the ground actually freezes. Once the ground freezes, we do pretty much stop the cleanup, because they just can't, everything's frozen to the ground, it's not efficient or effective to go out there and clean up.
Wait, so maybe there's a difference between cleanup and camp abatement?
There, traditionally, yes. As of late, not as much. So there is, we can post the camps and we can tell them to leave without an actual cleanup coming back. That's one of the problems we've identified in the past. It really wasn't that effective. People knew that we weren't swinging back through and able to get them out. So what we've kind of done this year is we've coordinated those together, and we are posting with the cleanup already scheduled. So that cleanup's going to happen with me a lot of time after the posting. Part of the other thing we run into in the wintertime is there was a case that just hit the Ninth Circuit out on Idaho, I believe it was, that really limits the government from evicting people on camps that have no place to go. So as soon as we hit the winter months, as in like a week, the campuses, like the shelters, will be hitting capacity, and we got to really watch. We're unable to abate or evict people out of their camps if we don't have a place for them to go. The city government sells a pretty good trouble for that.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. All right. Seeing no more questions on this topic, the next one was on warrants.
Yeah, so the answer to that one is actually pretty simple. Anytime that a law enforcement officer has contact with somebody that has warrants, we're actually obligated to serve them. There are very rare circumstances where we might not for one reason or another, but as a general rule, if you have an outstanding warrant and that's an order from the court, that we are required to take you to jail. So if we have contact with you, you have warrants, we make an arrest and take you to jail.
And do you have any data on when APD does go through the camps on average? I mean, how many times are we doing this? On average, how many times do people have warrants in the camps?
Serving warrants? I actually don't know that off the top of my head. That would be difficult to extract because a lot of our activity is location-based, but it's not specifically flagged as an illegal camp or not an illegal camp. Our system was just never designed to track incidents that way, and so it would be something that we have to dig out by reading every police report, basically, and trying to ferret that information out.
Mr. Dyson.
Yeah. What do you do when the person has no ID or claims they have no ID?
Well, you start to use your special police skill to try to figure out if that person's telling you the truth about who they are or not. And there are ways to do that, but it can be a challenge.
Are there any illegal immigrants? I doubt that there's very many in our homeless population here, but is that ever an issue?
I don't think so. I mean, I can tell you from my experience, just having been a patrol officer, that was generally not an issue. I don't think we see a real change in that.
No, generally when we go to the camps, we're there for the municipal laws that we can enforce. It's not a question that we ask. Generally, it's not. It's a federal law.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Dyson. Any other questions on this topic? All right, so third one on sexual assaults. Yeah, I brought this one up because I've been hearing reports that there have been an increase in sexual assaults in the camp, so I just wanted to get a sense of what APD is seeing and how we are responding to that.
Well, we respond to an allegation of sexual assault in a homeless camp or an illegal camp the way we would any place else. I mean, the protocol would not be different, and I think probably most of the body is aware of it. Anchorage and the Anchorage Police Department have what is essentially the gold standard for response to sexual assault. We have the multidisciplinary center where advocates and forensic nurses and detectives all work together. And if you go around the country and talk to other locations, that's what most other places are aspiring to. So we have a good model there. That would be the same regardless of location, like I said. As far as the frequency, I don't have any specific sense that there's an increase in frequency from illegal camps. And again, because we don't specifically track, a crime was in an illegal camp versus not in an illegal camp, that would be difficult. But just from a general, patrol is the first line response to any report of a crime like that, and I'm not getting a sense that we're seeing a big uptick there. But I can inquire with patrol supervisor staff.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah. So our mutual friend, Mr. Oliva, has told us dramatic stories about the sexual assaults going on fairly publicly. Can you give us a rough idea of, are you getting any or many convictions?
I don't know off the top of my head. I feel like our conviction rate on sexual assault is pretty good, but I just don't know the statistics.
Yeah, and this happened to be down around the Brother Francis shelter, I think they was reporting. All right. Only a related subject. It used to be that we had a huge backlog on processing the DNA samples. Is that still true?
Right now, today, we have about 1,744 sex assault kits that have not been tested. After talking with detectives and of course Deputy Chief McCoy, who is very well versed in this topic, he was sex assault detective, the unit supervisor, and the detective commander in that area for a long time. We don't believe any of those outstanding kits have specific evidentiary value for cases, so they're basically not hindering a prosecution. However, we would ultimately like to see those included in CODIS, the DNA database. So we have been working with the Sex Assault Kit Initiative, which is a program funded by, I think, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, if I remember correctly, to obtain our own grant for Anchorage to process all those kits. I met with the director last fall in Philadelphia. They expressed interest in seeing an application from Anchorage. You may be aware that the state had applied for a grant there previously and was working on that, but not unusually, Anchorage is the bulk of that issue because the bulk of the population is here. And so we've been working on that grant over the course of the summer with them. We feel like there's a good likelihood that we'll be successful. I actually had hoped to be able to say today that we have been successful. We're waiting to hear word, but I just haven't heard yet if we are or not. That would allow us to independently have all those kits tested and entered into CODIS outside of the state lab.
Yeah, that's a clear implication. The cost is a factor. What does it cost per sample?
To test a sexual assault kit, it's usually about $1,000 per sample, and a kit can contain, 5, 10, 15 samples. So the state lab is usually very particular about what samples are tested and so forth. So if you send a kit over, everything's not tested. Typically, they're very particular about what they expend those resources on. So $1,000 per sample.
So 1,000 samples and $1,000 each.
There's actually about 1,700 kits. They may have multiple samples per kit, and then $1,000 per sample.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. All right. So before I turn the gavel back to Mr. Dyson, any other questions on this first part on our agenda?
Why don't you let people testify on this issue? We got 10 minutes at least.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll go ahead and go with the advice of Mr. Dyson. Does anyone in the audience have any questions or want to testify? Ms. Chase.
Yes. I wanted to ask Lieutenant Carson. In my conversations with John Rada, there is no one working on cleaning up the kinks. Now, he did say that work service, which could be one person or 3 people, they would include those people to clean up the encampments, but they can choose whether or not they want to do it. And I also don't understand why the abatements were stopped on the 28th of September instead of continuing until it snowed.
So
I'm asking about personnel and why was it stopped on the 28th and who directed that stop?
funding, the RADA, so they weren't stopped. So the summer personnel that were hired, the funding for that ran out on the 28th or 30th, I think, somewhere in there, ran out, and those personnel were basically let go for summer. They're seasonal employees. I think RADA would like to be done, but we still have scheduled cleanups with community work service throughout at least the end of October, and then we're also talking about, based on weather, how much longer we can do community work service. Is subsidized camp, the gold mine there, has actually been working with the state. So after we get the camp cleaned up, we actually got permission to come with the contractors. I'm gonna trim up all the trees again. And then we're gonna, community work services in the library area. And then the weekend after, when we're focusing on those two other, kind of been identified by the public as criminal camps. We got, some of the bikes and property. And we're gonna do those, and that's in coordination with community work service. So the summer team is gone, but the cleanups are continuing, just on a slower scale in the winter. And it's all based on funding.
Well, I don't understand why there wasn't more funding. I mean, you know, any crisis in a community can gather the funding to handle things. I find this quite disturbing.
Thank you, Ms. Chase, and I suggest that you come and testify before the assembly when we get into the budget hearing process. And
Stephanie.
Yes, Ms. Rhodes.
I have a comment and two questions. The first comment is that we've heard repeatedly about data issues here involving encampments. It is really interesting to hear that there's no way to collect data on how many people are contacted with warrants in homeless camps. It's also a little shocking to hear that we have no way of collecting data on how many sexual assaults occur in those venues. Because if we are going to prevent sexual assaults, we need to know where they occur and where victim vulnerability is the highest. So I think that those are important things that would need to be addressed in the future as to strategy for collecting data in encampments. But my questions are for Lieutenant Carson, is it? One question is, how many retrenchments have we had in those camps that have been cleaned? And second question is, you've now seen what rolled out since last year. With no cleanups this winter, what is your forecast of how many camps we're going to have without any changes to our community services or anything else, which we really don't have, for next year at the beginning of spring?
So, we do see as we do a zone cleanup, and when we leave the zone, we do see camps coming back in. We predicted that was going to happen. I think, kind of go on with your second question.
Well, do we know how many data? Again, how many?
Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you exactly. That would have to be we'd have to go through it individually, add it up.
So again, in terms of data, I guess the other thing I'm looking to extract here is that you're not collecting data on that.
We're collecting.
I think what I'd say is we collect a lot of data. It's just if you ask a specific question, sometimes we have to go into the data set and pull that out, and so we may not know off the top of our heads. It doesn't mean the data is not there, but sometimes it's not easy to collect. A lot of the information is in narrative form and police reports, and somebody has to spend staff time to read through the reports, pull that information out, and synthesize it into something that's usable. So,
would that data be important to you? Why would the city not want that data? Because if a public member requests it as a public information request, they're told it costs $40,000 to do that. So I guess in terms of entrenchments, I'd like to know how many entrenchments there are now after the $500,000 of city money is spent to remove. And I'd also like a real forecast, predicted forecast from you of what you know and what you've experienced and cleaned up. What are we going to look at on May 1 when it goes?
So you'd like us to guess what we think it's going to be?
You bet. You're experts. You could give a good guesstimate.
I can tell you, I've talked with Parks and Rec. This is one of the first years they truly believe that and with the CAP officers, they truly believe that they've actually made an impact on the amount of homeless camps out there in cleanup and past camps and things like that. Each year we're increasing by 7% on the amount of trash that we're actually cleaning up. We're becoming more efficient, and they actually feel like they broke over the top of the mountain and are hopefully each year going to have less and less of that garbage out in the woods in the park system. And that was through a conversation with Rod and the camp people. What we do see is a downward trend in camps in the wintertime. There's not as many people camping. They come into the shelter systems and the churches and the support systems that are there. But there is camps that do survive through the winter. But I don't think next year you'll see as many as we had this year, or will for the following year as we even have the last something we're going to solve in a single year.
So I just want to reflect back to you, because I don't want to come here constantly as a complainer. I do want to acknowledge and to tell the police and the Parks and Recs and the MIT team that there has been substantial cleanups that have been done. There is no question that the $500,000 were not squandered. You picked up more than 200 tons of trash this year. How do you like that for your money? But in the last year, you picked up about 174,000 tons. And in the year before that, it was about 50-something tons. So actually, it's increased. And the only data you're collecting is how many tons of trash you're picking up. So if we don't know how many people are entrenching and how many more people are going to come over the winter and in the spring before you start up any kind of effort again, that's if there's funding, then we really don't know anything except how much trash pickup we're doing.
All right, thank you, Ms. Rhodes. I think Ms. Brick has a quick response, and then I think we have time for maybe one more person to testify or ask questions.
I've provided copies of the community plan for everyone, and if you turn to the page that has the health and public safety character in the system, if you turn to that page, this is the beginning of activities that will be
Maybe page 8.
If you turn to the page that has the health and public safety, I think what the community's been pointing out is that it's what's happening is Lieutenant Carson's being asked questions of John Brada's department. It is something that really needs to have an organized view for data and for everyone to provide their data in so that it's available, so when one of the members of the team is asked a question, the information is available for them. And what's happening here is we have everyone who works on different parts of it basically trying to describe the elephant. Well, it looks like this, it has a trunk. No, it looks like this, it has a tail. But it's a bigger animal. And this document will allow us the ability to come together as the municipality in that column, which is the one that the community and everyone is supporting us taking lead on and organizing this data. And so tomorrow we're going to make some announcements. We're going to have some information about our summer outreach count. We're going to have the data compiled that we have available for camp cleanup. The tonnage, that is correct, that's how data is reported. And it will provide that view in a much more, I'm hoping, comprehensive way so everyone can see it. It is certainly not complete. We don't get client level information from everyone on outreach. We are taking steps to try to address that. We're launching some new tools, but we're certainly not there. We're not saying it's perfect, but we will try to put it in one place so everyone can see it in one snapshot.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Burke. All right, Mr. Webb, very quickly, if you could.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Chief Della, you indicated that when the CAP team goes in and/or patrol officers go into camps, that if you identify criminal activity, you take action on this. That's obviously the question I have is, does the CAP team go in on any occasion that they're not supposed to camp, and do patrol officers go in? And if so, can you tell me when and under what circumstances? Because frankly, I've never seen it.
So I'll go backwards. So with patrol officers, typically they go in if there's a report of some kind of problem there. I don't think that it's very often that they're just patrolling through the camps. I think that over the summer, having officers on bikes on the bike trails, they did occasionally patrol through the camps, but it's not a super frequent occurrence. It tends to be more often when there's a reported problem.
Go ahead.
Okay. And then I'll actually let Lieutenant Carson answer for the CAP team. Obviously, they do go there to do the postings, but anyway, go ahead.
So, yeah, we go there for the postings, and when we're posting camps in an area, we grid for more camps that may be unreported. The other thing is our outreach people. We may not go out and post a camp until it's scheduled for cleanup. We actually have our outreach people that go and contact every reported camp. They contact them prior to being posted, and if they're posted, then we contact them afterwards. So every camp reported is contacted by our outreach people to try and get them connected with the services to try and get them out of the camps.
Sure.
So officers may not, but part of our team does.
Understood, but outreach folks are going in and handing out cards. They're not doing criminal investigations. They're just trying to make contact with the camper. Right? There was a, I guess another question. Do we know how many camps were posted this summer?
We do. I don't have it with me. I have it on the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Okay, because that's another key piece of data.
That will be available tomorrow.
Okay, great. Can't wait. There was a
one last comment.
A quick question. You reported in the paper, I believe, indicating that the online camp reporting system was great, and it made it possible for patrol officers to get information immediately about any new camp that shows up.
I think actually the quote was that CAP officers have access to that information.
Okay, I can assure you that was not the quote, but okay. So, the question is, they've got immediate access, but they don't take immediate action in response to those reports. I'm assuming that there is some lengthy delay. That's my personal experience. So the implication was that we're out there immediately as soon as we get a report, but that's not actually the case.
Well, I don't know which quote you're talking about. The CAP team does have immediate access to that information, and then I actually don't know how long we have there.
So it depends on many answers. So the outreach gets out there pretty quickly. As far as the CAP team actually going out there, that's part of one of the changes we made this year, trying to streamline the system. Is unless we have we're able to schedule cleanup for that area, we're not going out and posting the camp until we have that cleanup schedule. That's what's allowed us to move, from how much garbage we cleaned up last year to, the increase this year is we're trying to make the system more efficient. So we don't go out there and post the camp until we actually can get a cleanup schedule within the 10 days after we're setting the hours.
Thank you.
No, mine is slightly different. You go ahead first.
Oh, well, just a quick question on fuel and propane tanks. Earlier in the year, there was some discussion about a joint ordinance between the two committees being put forward, and just checking in if we're still going to be talking about that in the future, or if it's done.
I don't know that there's a need to do it jointly. I mean, we certainly cooperate.
And this was an ordinance that we actually dug back up recently and reviewed, and my understanding is that legal is going to review it.
Okay, thanks.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you. Just on a point that was made about how we've gone from 50 to 120 to 200 tons or 300, 500 tons, whatever, however many tons we've removed, I don't think that necessarily demonstrates that we have more camps going on. I think what that may demonstrate, and we'll know in the future, hopefully very soon, is if our cleanup is more effective, because at some point, and I think that the point is well made by the speakers, that when we have actual data, we'll be able to know.
Right.
We'll see up to a certain point when we get it really cleaned up for the first time after years of decay, and then it slows down. And then we'll know after that if it goes up or down, the volume, whether it's an increase or decrease. But I think we're just catching up. It's deferred maintenance.
All right. I want to go on to the second subject. Sir?
We're actually showing that we have less homeless people this year. Our initial numbers, we were thinking around 70, but we had included families, which we didn't in the prior year. I would caution that, the data we just started really collecting last year, this year, so statistics when they're in their infancy can be a little bit inaccurate until you get many years of statistics. But we're upwards of, it's looking like around 300 less homeless people counted on our appointment time count this year over last year.
Thank you.
That's probably some of the housing.
All right.
Where's Mr. Crow?
All right, so I want to go on to the second subject. I hope to have time for more testimony and input on both. We are considering putting in city ordinance that it's a crime to knowingly and recklessly transfer a communicable disease. Not specific to sexually transmitted, but certainly that's a main driver. We found out, Mr. Gates has found out maybe 14 other states have done this. They've been in that process long enough that several of them are going back and revising it and so on. Is somebody here from Public Health? Mr. Gates.
I'm sorry, Mr. Dyson. I said 40-something states, not 14. There's a lot of states with similar ordinance. I'm sorry, there's a lot of states, similar law.
Right.
40-something, not 14.
I was inaccurate. 11 states. Is no one here from Public Health? Yes. We're.
Like me to say something? I'm here to learn.
Yeah. So we very definitely want input and feedback from Public Health of whether or not criminalizing the knowing transmission of disease would be helpful from your perspective. And is somebody here from the prosecutor's office? Yeah, it's same to you. Do you have any preliminary thoughts?
Well, I think this is Seneca Fino for the record from the City Prosecutor's Office. I think with existing laws, there are some mechanisms for prosecuting that if a case came before us.
Yes.
Arguably under assault or reckless endangerment or even harassment. But I agree with Mr. Gates that a lot of other states do specifically have this language in a standalone ordinance. And so obviously if a case came before us that fell under these elements, it would be infinitely easier to prosecute if there was a specific law in the books.
All right, so you can imagine the legal issues, and we want your help to make it as effective a tool for you. Mr. Constant.
We've now heard twice that states have done this and states have done this, but we're not here concerned with the state law. What is the parallel process for local governments? Do we have analysis conducted at that level?
Do you want to answer that?
You know, looking at this law, I've looked at most of the state statutes. There's one reason I do that is because we're a home rule municipality. We've got legislative powers, otherwise prohibited. So we can make state statutes across the nation. If I started to look at ordinances in other local jurisdictions, we don't find any in Alaska. In other states, they have very different government structures, so I wouldn't rely on ordinances. I feel that 40-something different statutes that we looked at are sufficient guidance as to what we can do. I guess a little summary of what I've seen, there's like 4 or 5 different approaches that states have taken. And, you know, some of these ordinances or laws prohibiting or making it unlawful to transmit sexually transmitted disease or venereal disease were first enacted in like 1910 around World War I. Some of them have developed. There's been some recent changes in some jurisdictions that have kind of modernized what they do. They had a lot more administrative burdens. What I've found, though, is none of these have been ruled unconstitutional. The old ones, the new ones, these different approaches, I think, are mostly legislative policy choices as to what approach to take. So I had initially started drafting something that was taking a more modern approach, but it doesn't really fit well with, I think, our circumstances here in Alaska and our state statutes and the evidence that we need to be proven. And some of the, I guess, older laws that have been updated, but still not taking this modern approach that I refer to, they are not been ruled unconstitutional. They're effectively wrong proofs. So I told Mr. Dyson I need to go back to the drawing board, and that's why I don't have a draft for you today. So I apologize for that delay. But I think it's very important, especially with criminal laws, to draft something that's specific and has evidentiary burdens that the prosecutor's office can actually handle and are reasonable to do. And don't take, I guess, prerequisite administrative steps. For example, some of the state statutes that have been changed to require state medical officers and medical officer to give a notice to the defendant, telling them that we're not to engage in certain types of activity or certain things you're supposed to do to spread transmission of disease. And so if we need to prove that here, that doesn't really work. That's kind of a modern approach that's been taken in some jurisdictions. So, whereas something more generic and older approaches is very straightforward. For example, Colorado would say it's unlawful for any person who has knowledge of reasonable grounds to suspect that he or she is infected with a sexually transmitted infection to willfully expose another person without infection or perform an act that exposes or infects the person to or with a sexually transmitted infection. So, I mean, that's kind of straightforward, and that's the approach I think that will work here, but with some refinement. So, sorry to give you a long answer.
So, I would just like a quick back information from that analysis. And that would be an analysis of how these laws are implemented on who they are effectively prosecuting. Because what I understand is that there are certain demographics that are actually affected more by these laws than others. And I would like to look really closely at who's affected, how, and why by the law that we're proposing.
Yeah. And that's legitimate. And I want to know, is it working? What's been the positive results, if any? And in my questions here, are there legitimate privacy issues that we need to protect even for perpetrators and all that sort of thing? As I understand it, that where this goes, if you've already been tested, it's part of the public health record, I think, and then, but those records are private, protected under HIPAA, and so on. But then if a crime comes up and you're wanting to prove that the perpetrator was knowingly and thus recklessly spreading the disease, then the fact you got a way to prove that the person knew that they had the disease. But it's a very legitimate one. I appreciate the thing on the cities and the state. I'm interested in wherever it works and whatever the jurisdiction, but it's a reasonable one to do. Mr. Dunbar and Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. I think Ms. Quinn-Davidson wants to get in the queue as well. So I wrote down several questions here, and I think that you've, in your own questions, have one or two. So I am curious for you, the sponsor, how you're going to get these questions answered. I hope we don't have just Dean try to research all the answer. That would place a lot of burden on him. And I'm hoping there are people from the administration that can help answer these questions as we make a decision to go forward or not. And to me, the questions I'm most interested in, again, they're kind of here, is, you know, have these laws, there are two primary reasons I think you might do this. One is if you thought it had a serious impact on infection rates, if you could lower infection rates. The second would be because there are certain kind of criminals that you want to deter or to punish, right? And so those are two of the questions I want answered. So the first is, in the states that have done this, is there any statistical evidence that it actually has lowered infection rates? And if it hasn't, then I think that's sort of one strike against this kind of law. The second is there a sort of class of criminal that is doing this, that is sort of getting away with it, that we need to punish? And look, I mean, we just had a very high-profile case in Anchorage where a man sexually assaulted a woman, choked her unconscious, and then ejaculated on her. And it turned out we couldn't prosecute him under a sex crime because we just didn't have that law, that releasing semen on someone wasn't, as I understand it, just from the media reports, not going deep into the case, that it wasn't prosecutable because we lack that law. So that's, you know, that to me speaks in favor of this kind of law. But I guess because we have the prosecutor here, I'd like to ask the question of, have there been cases where this kind of law would have been useful that you know of in this city, or perhaps in the state if you have any knowledge, where this law wasn't available to us?
I can only think of one case where we specifically had an instance where a person was spitting and claimed to have hepatitis. And that, so we have lots of spitting cases or fluid contact cases, but I can think of one where there was an allegation by the perpetrator themselves that they had a disease that they were trying to share.
Okay. So then my next question then, and I don't know who is able to question to
be concise. We're up, run out of time, please.
We have till 12:30.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
But great point. Let's keep it concise. No, but how often are these actually prosecuted? So this might go to kind of what Mr. Constant was going at. We had sodomy laws on our books for a long time. Only one group of people was ever prosecuted under them, frequently, and that was an equal protection issue. But even beyond that, we had a lot of sort of basically dead letter laws that no one was ever prosecuted on. And so I'm curious how often these in other states are actually prosecuted, or other jurisdictions, or are they like some laws where bodies like us pass them and then, you know, realistically they just sort of sit on the books as dead letter?
That's why I said we're very interested in how it's worked in other jurisdictions. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my question is, would the medical professionals resist reporting individuals, or are they allowed to report that information? And are they doing it currently?
Well, currently Alaska and many other states have a reporting requirement when a health professional or laboratory runs a positive STI result. But they're just reporting the data, not the names and the confidential information and so forth. So we do have that data reporting requirement already in our state law. That's hasn't tied into a criminal law. We do have in Alaska and in many other states, for example, a requirement that people incarcerated, the Department of Corrections, or people convicted of a sex crime are required to get tested for STIs, STDs, things like that. So there are a number of laws, but when we're talking about prosecuting the actual transmission, we don't have something that specifically, and many other states do and some do not.
So we would have to tie in some sort of reporting requirement for, you know, doctors and clinics. You don't think that's necessary?
I don't think we can do it.
Can we do it? They might be able to do it. I don't think we can do it.
Yeah, I suspect that it may take a warrant, but also officers in court can get access.
I'm not sure I'm understanding exactly what you're asking. The officers of the court can access the data. And sure.
No.
If you've got a prosecution, this is something that an issue that I haven't delved into too much. Like, if you're going to prosecute someone for this, can you, in discovery, obtain that defendant's medical records and history and so forth, that private protected information? And I haven't dived into that issue. I don't know if someone has experience in that area in context.
Mr. Dunbar, sorry?
Via search warrant, yes.
Yeah.
You can get medical information.
Yeah, and I suspect this will come when a crime has been reported.
Right.
And then you go out after data and so on. Did you want to follow up, Mr. Dunbar?
No, I have a separate question. So
all right. Ms. Quinn Davison.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. A lot of my questions have been asked, so I'll just keep it brief. But I have concerns, questions about the needs, so I'd be curious to hear from Public Health and also from the prosecutor's office about whether we need this. I think the devil is sometimes in the details, so what does disease mean? Is disease a viral infection? Could you go to a party and have a cold and be guilty of this? So I think I just need to understand more about these terms and how that would work practically. And then I am concerned about who this would impact. I don't have stats on me, but I suppose that lower income individuals are more likely to have untreated health conditions because they don't have health care. And I think that further criminalizing them for a situation they're already in, maybe not out of their choosing, is problematic. So I have some concerns about it, but I'm eager to learn more.
Yeah, thank you. Chris?
Yeah, to follow that up, the brief research that I did demonstrated that it's in fact low-income people who utilize public services, right, who go to public health clinics, who have a public record of their health care, are the ones who tend to be the ones who get hit with these kinds of rules. And so there is a class barrier there that's the opposite. It's not that they're untreated, it's that they're treated by the men. And I do thank you for framing this not as a sexual issue more broadly, because when it's framed more narrowly, it certainly gets targeted more narrowly. So I am certainly interested in the details.
Yeah, and please, from my perspective, this is serious. It's a kind of assault, you know, and you know, if you get up in a bar fight and get a few bruises, fine. What if you're injured and you're going to live with that the rest of your life and you're impaired? Some of these diseases are incurable with modern medicine. So somebody who is transmuted has changed the life of that person, you know, for the foreseeable future. To not consider that serious, and our issue, my issue, is not the class of the people who are doing it. It's the severity of the impact of what they've done that should be the criteria. And if this is useful, remember, law enforcement is not very good at preventing crime. You can take bad guys out of circulation, but we're trying to stop the local distributors if possible, but also send the message: if you damage somebody's health forever, that's a very serious thing, and you need to pay some consequences for it. Another sidelight from this may be civil actions that will come. Somebody, by reckless, knowing behavior, has damaged you materially. Most of us will think that the perpetrators largely have no resources at all, but is there the possibility of recovering damages? Mr. Dunbar.
So just on that last point, I think you can already do that. I think you can already sue civilly and get damages for this kind of thing. I could be mistaken. If there's a better attorney in here than me. Any other attorney?
Yes, you can.
Yes, thank you. There's one of our more prominent attorneys. I think what Ms. Quinn-Davidson said is really important, that the devil is really in the details here. And I still am sort of hesitant to have a municipality step out and do this if we are limited in the ways that I think we are. It might be more appropriate to the state. But even if we get over that hurdle, I really think that we need to be thinking about, for example, the reckless versus knowing or intentional, that mens rea, I think is really important. Because, like Ms. Quinn-Davidson just said, you know, if you have a cold and you go to work because you need to go to work, you can't afford to miss a paycheck, you have probably, at least negligently and perhaps recklessly, you know, threatened everybody else in that workplace with your disease, right? But we are not trying to criminalize that. If we are, we're not, right? So that's to me why if there was any way I was going to support this, it would have to be that knowing or intentional. It would have to be a pretty willful act.
Absolutely. You have a question?
No, wait. Mr. Dunbar, I can make like 3 points. First, California modernized their law and started to model out this draft ordinance after what California did. They called them, they had a more generic description of the disease, communicable or infectious disease that's specific to a sexually transmitted disease or infection. And that's one reason why I decided to back off, because I started to see that the way they defined the disease that you transmit was too general. It could apply to a cold, and that doesn't make sense. So I didn't think that would be a good way for this draft ordinance to go exactly as you are pointing out. So I think it was better to be specific and define a sexually transmitted infection. And you've seen in the other states and some of the laws define it as chlamydia, gonorrhea, hepatitis, HIV, and maybe a couple of others. So just specific to those type. I think that would be a more effective and prosecutable law than if we had a generic communicable disease prohibition. So I have seen that. And secondly, historically, a lot of states, in reaction to the AIDS and HIV epidemic in the 80s, passed a lot of laws that really specified more severe punishments for HIV transmittal and things like that. And some of them have been changing that and equalizing HIV transmittal punishments with other sexually transmitted diseases and infections. And I think that's appropriate. And that first, I think what Ms. Quinn-Davidson saying, how do we define this? So the way I would define it in the draft I've been working on is just like I recently graded gonorrhea, chlamydia, hepatitis, HIV, all the other positive drugs and the sexually transmitted infection, and then treatment for different types of diseases. I have no points. Let me get back to that if I can.
We'll get you back in the queue. You got a comment?
Just notice this maybe goes back to Mr. Constant's original question about the difference between state statutes and ordinances. But I did notice in the little bit of research that I did that oftentimes when the conduct was done knowingly, it was categorized as a felony. And when it was done recklessly, it was categorized as a misdemeanor, which is obviously what we cover. So that may be something to consider as well. There are a lot of states that do seem, I shouldn't say a lot of states, there were some states that were prosecuting just under regular assault statutes, simple assault statutes, which we have, and also arguments to be made for prosecuting as assault with a deadly instrument, especially if it's HIV or another disease that can result in death. So that may be something, another thing to consider is whether you think what we have now is sufficient if one of these cases came around, or if there is benefit to having this specific language on the books.
And from my perspective, we'll be relying quite heavily on your judgment and experience about that very thing. Mr. Constant and then Mr. Gates.
Well, Mr. Welton hadn't spoken.
I'm sorry.
So I would step out of the way for him and I'd come back here.
So are you aware, has the state tried to do something similar?
Not in the last 20 years that I know of. And as I've thought about this, see, on our misdemeanors, I understand it from Mr. Gates, you can't have more than a year in jail. You know, and I've already talked to a couple legislators, and they may do things, you know, and so on and so forth. I have a bit of experience, so is Mr. Peterson there, and waiting for them to take leadership on these kind of issues. Maybe some of you will see it, not my lifetime, and they're very, very distracted by statewide issues. I don't mind us taking leadership and hopefully set a paradigm that they can easily follow, but I'd like to see more severe than 1 year in jail for somebody that gives a life-changing disease. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thanks. I come back to this idea of how we frame this as sexually transmitted or just somehow communicable. And the one case that Ms. Thanos suggested has occurred was a case when somebody spit on somebody else, which is not a sexual act. And so definitionally, I think we have a challenge. And in fact, I think where you're going to have issues like that, or where somebody spits on somebody's food and is actually carrying hepatitis or some thing that would easily be communicated in a way, that has nothing to do with the sexual act. And so I would be very cautious on that. And I also have a question, and just in contemplating, somebody says to you, I spit on you and I'm giving you hepatitis now. You know, the statutes for assault, I think it's assault is if you are in fear for yourself, right? The lowest level of assault doesn't require an actual attack. And so I'm wondering if in some ways there is already some protection just against somebody who would even say something, let alone do an actual act of transmitting.
I've been there, done that one. Mr. Dahl?
I don't know if it helps or hurts the discussion, but Ms. Thino and I were talking about it, and she mentioned somebody spitting with hepatitis, and I think I was thinking of a different case, but I was involved in a case like that where I was with another officer. We had a suspect. He spit in the officer's face, the other officer's face, and declared that he had hepatitis and I think maybe AIDS, but and with some further statements about take that home to your family, stuff like that. And one of the assistant district attorneys at the time successfully prosecuted that case, I think under assault too. So it was a felony assault. It was treated fairly seriously, and it was been a while, but I'm pretty sure we got a conviction. So there is some opportunity to use the assault statutes to prosecute.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Gates?
Speaking to that issue specifically, our current code has a harassment law that says it's unlawful to subject another person to offenses physical contact, which includes contact with human animal blood, mucus, saliva, semen, urine, vomited species. That sort of covers spitting on someone's food intended to expose them to it. I'm sorry, it's disgusting to speak out of family. But so earlier I said I had another point to make, and it was one about the Metro State, as Ms. Dino mentioned, the draft ordinance I'm working on had split two different offenses. One knowingly transmitting sexually transmitted disease, one recklessly, perhaps with different punishment levels, Class A be misdemeanor. Perhaps knowingly should be a felony. Then, as the prosecutor has informed us in the past, in times we don't prosecute felonies. So perhaps the knowingly transmittal of an STI wouldn't be appropriate for our code. To make it a Class A misdemeanor, perhaps it would. So somewhat of a policy cost. Some other states have a 5-year imprisonment punishment for knowing transmission, things like that. So, and one other thing I had meant to mention earlier is the tort offense. We do have some case law in Alaska, at least one, where a couple that was, they got divorced as a result of some issues. One of those issues was a husband giving the wife an STI, and she added that as a tort claim in the case, and that was upheld as valid. So we do have that at common law in Alaska.
Mr. Peterson, did I skip you?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Mr. Dunbar?
A question for you then, Dean. Is the reckless offense a lesser included offense of a felony offense? Because if not, we can only prosecute misdemeanors. Then we have a perverse situation where someone who is knowingly doing it could get away, but someone who's reckless would be prosecuted by us. But I assume reckless is a lesser included offense, no?
Yes, that's correct.
I still think it's an issue, though. I mean, we don't prosecute felonies. I really do think, well, we can get this more in discussion when we get to it, but I think this is more appropriate for the state.
I think I concur. So, in my view, I take a high view of making law on any level. And it's one case where we as a culture elect people to make policy decisions, and we say to our state or our jurisdiction, this is what we believe about how we treat one another and what is acceptable and not. And I'm eager for the message to get out to people who are deliberately or inadvertently communicating diseases that are a life sentence for the victim, that that's not acceptable here. And we're expecting very responsible conduct from everyone. Thou shalt not infect your neighbor, and so on. So there's a value, and just like a law that you all helped me with here a few weeks ago, we've kind of made every adult responsible for going to the rescue of a kid that's being kidnapped, molested, or assaulted. You know, it's a duty of us citizens, and I'm glad to have that message out there. But the practical result also, I'm not interested in doing things just to do it or to look good. We want to solve problems. Any other questions or comments from the people at the table? All right, then let's have the rest of the meeting for comments from the audience and questions. We need your help to do this well, whatever it is. All right. Yeah, Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I actually did have one question for the chief, and regarding a report we received last week on the budget, and specifically non-sworn officers. Could you inform us a bit about what the short-term and long-term plan? Do we know how many more non-sworn staff, that we need, and what that looks like?
Sure. So thanks for that question. I think that the last round of budget revision showed an increase of 3 non-sworn positions in the police department that we'll designate for dispatch. Dispatch is the place that's in most critical need right now. There are other areas of the department as well. We had been asking for 20 new positions for next year. I think that's where we need to be. In some ways, non-sworn is somewhat like sworn staffing, where we have an idea of where we think we should be, we try that out, we see how it feels, and then maybe we make adjustments from there. and there's sort of an ongoing discussion. Are the service levels meeting the community's expectations? Dispatch is a good example of that. We all hear regularly that people get frustrated when they call the non-emergency line, and it takes a while to have that call answered. So that's one of our priorities. And I think one of your other questions was, how many do we need, and what does that cost look like? So that would be another 17, basically, to get to where we requested for next year, and it's a cost of around $1.2 million. So then, in addition to dispatch, we need additional staff and records, and also in the property and evidence section. They're kind of the three main areas.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so, for a non-sworn officer, how long is the training period?
Great question. So it depends a little bit on what section that person is going to. The training for a police dispatcher and or call taker, there's sort of two categories of employees in dispatch, can be pretty extensive. I mean, as everybody can imagine, that's a pretty complex job. So the training, it can approach almost a year long. To bring new staff into the records section, they've been doing a lot of work in that area to streamline that process, and it's more along the lines of a month and a half to 2 months. So it's a little bit quicker there. Property and evidence is kind of in between the two. We're working in both property and evidence and dispatch to make sure that that process is as efficient as it can be, but still set new municipal employees up for success in their new job and not shortchange them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. Mr. Domboski and then Ms. Crossan.
Thank you. I'm going to get on my typical soapbox. So I want to say, first of all, I have noticed something I've not seen ever, really. There's been a few times I've actually seen patrol cars on Peters Creek, which is refreshing. I really appreciate it. When are we going to have the model where we have, routine officers in routine areas? And the second question to that, because the community patrols out all the time. I'm not asking for officers to go to a community council meeting, I think that's too redundant, but it would be nice to have, once we have those officers there, have a point of contact, not for them to call all the time, but so they don't have to, pester everybody else. It would be nice to open the lines of communication. So is that on the horizon?
It is, and I completely agree with both of those things. So something we've been talking about for a while is sort of making the patrol area boundaries mimic the community council boundaries. We have a project underway at APD to try to replace the whole computer system that runs the department. It's the computer-aided dispatching, it's the records management, it's the mobile stuff in the cars. We're waiting for the contractor to provide us with a complete solution. I sort of refuse to accept the final product until it actually works correctly, and so that's it's taking them a little bit more time. And I had wanted to wait to do that and do it in the new system. Well, that's been pushed back again, so we just had a conversation last week, myself, the deputy chief, and some of the captains about we're just going to do it now. Even though we're going to do it in the old system, it's going to take a little bit extra work. I believe that we can get that, so we're not going to wait any longer. We're going to change the feed boundaries. That's probably on the way. Actually, as we speak, it'll take a little while because there's a lot of programming to happen in CAD to make that work. But we're just going to do it. We're already sort of moving towards the model of having people a little bit more consistently assigned to the different areas. What I would like to get to eventually is that you can see either on the department's webpage or some other resource who your normally assigned patrol officers are. So you have a question and you can send them an email, leave them a voicemail, something like that. It's something that's not urgent, so you don't mind if you wait 3 days for them to come back to work, but you can talk to somebody who's familiar with the area. That, when you hear people talk about community policing, like everybody gets tired of hearing those two words together, but really what that means is exactly that. Like you have somebody that you can connect with, that you're familiar with, they're familiar with your issues, and that is really what that means. Despite some
it means a lot more than that too.
Right. It does, but there's a lot of other stuff that goes with that. But what tends to get lost is at the base level. That's really what it means. Is You have officers that know the people in their area, the people know those officers, and that kind of engagement happens.
Well, that's what I was hoping
Good
for.
things happen.
And the only thing I would say is, because I know you kind of didn't speak to this directly, and I know that in the past there's been resistance to it, but especially with the community patrols, I think APD has to reestablish some sort of meaningful relationship. That's my perception. I'm hearing frustration from Anchorage Community Patrols basically saying APD's really not talking to us anymore, they're not communicating anymore. And I think it's a miss. I think it's a real opportunity. And I don't know to what extent they're talking. But that's why when these officers get assigned, if one of them could make the effort to say, hey, you know, in the Eagle River, we have Eagle River and Chugach, hey, here, I'm Bob, here's my number. If you have a specific question, you know, you can call me. Because I don't think it'll be abused. I really don't.
No, I don't think we have any specific objection to that. I'm not sure why.
Well, I keep reassuring them that that's not what I'm hearing. The message I'm getting from AP is this is where they want to go. And so I just want to be able to bring something affirmative back to them that it's not a no, it's give us a little time, we're going to get there.
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely not a no.
All right, but I want to get everybody in here. I'm going to skip you for a minute, Chris, and Mr. Weddleton, and then the lady back here in white.
Sorry, Chris. I guess a couple things. So you said we saw in the budget 3 more positions, but you're saying you need 20?
Well, you know, when we start the budget process, we ask for things that we think we need, and that, you know, as we work our way through it, we figure out what we can actually have, and so I think that's how we ended up at 3. The other thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about that, because I did look at my notes, was we've had the other component in dispatch that has been an issue for a while is we've had quite a number of employees that were on long-term absences that have now left employment with the MOA, and we're able to fill those positions. So positions that technically had a body in them, but they were actually at work every day, we're filling those. We're in the process of doing that now. We've just either just hired some dispatchers or just about to hire some. And so with that plus adding 3 more, I mean, I feel like that's going to be helpful. You know, the one thing that has an effect on how quickly calls get answered is how many people are in the room.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
So I think it seems to me APD does a lot of good work, and I'm not sure anyone's tired of the phrase community policing. People just want to see more of it. But I think you guys do something, there's a case or something. I mean, you probably know. I think it's smart just to do a police report online instead of just telling the officer who's going to just write it down. But it seems like follow-up isn't done in a way, so people feel like I never heard anything. I was talking to somebody yesterday who was robbed in December and had guns stolen and so on, and he's gotten some information that some of the guns were retrieved, but there's no follow-up. Was anything done? And my understanding is now the officer who was involved will get back, but it doesn't seem efficient to me to have a police officer tracking that stuff as to have staff sitting at a desk going through just to call back or send an email and say, hey, you know, this happened, or we got the crook or something. And I know it gets complicated because it goes into a court system you're not connected with, but it seems like that's a weak link on support for the APD's good work.
I totally agree. And so something that, you know, I've acknowledged multiple times in the past, the department is working to improve is that feedback loop with people that call and request service.
Better.
Yeah.
I think you've gotten a lot better.
Well, we're putting a lot of effort into it, so I appreciate it. If it feels that way, that's good news. It's something that historically we've not been great about, and as we're bringing more and more people online, they're having time to close that loop. But you know, I hear the same complaint pretty regularly also, which is, hey, I called the police and I think you never showed up, or you did show up but I don't know what happened or whatever. So we're really encouraging everybody at the department, from the newest patrol officers on up, to close that loop. Let people know what you did. It doesn't take very long, and it's important for the community to understand that we did come and do something, whatever that is, and explain it. And generally the feedback we get from the public when we do that is very positive. It's like, okay, I understand now why this happened. I understand you came and did whatever you did. So I agree. I mean, it's basically not taking credit for your work.
Well said. Ms. Traney.
These are questions that Dick had, and Felix address the first one, and Dick's concern was that 3 officers wouldn't be enough. But his other question was that you're talking about cutting $1 million in overtime reduction for this next budget, and how can you achieve that? And are you going to be coming a follow-up? Are you going to be coming back first quarter budget revisions and being asked for more because we can't do it?
So a lot of those things are interrelated, right? Like every part of our budget is sort of tied in some way to the rest of it. So with regards to the overtime, you know, I think all the command staff at APD recognizes that you know, we don't have the ability to have an infinite budget. So at some point there's going to be a limit, and we need to operate within that limit. We get that, and that's perfectly fine. So we're constantly trying to figure out how can we maximize what we're doing with what we've been given. And you know, the APD budget is a substantial chunk of the overall MOA budget, so we take that very seriously. We've gotten to a point where we've added new officers. We're replacing and sort of filling some positions that had bodies in them in dispatch, but we're actually coming to work on a regular basis. We're hopefully adding a few new positions, and I think all of that together will give us an opportunity to try to manage the overtime a little bit. You know, we're in a position with dispatch right now. This year, dispatch is on track to spend about $1 million in overtime. That's a lot of money, and that's a whole lot of full-time positions. If we could transition away from doing that work to having people that were doing it on straight time, but you run into this problem where you're doing it on overtime and just getting by, but to bring the people on, it takes about a year, so now you have to double up, so you're paying the overtime to get the work done, plus you're bringing new people online. We're trying to work our way through that transition as best we can. You know, to be perfectly honest, it's going to be a challenge to cut that kind of overtime out of our budget. I think it's worth the attempt.
All right.
We're going to see how successful we are. And
we'll run out of time. Excellent answer. Was there anything else, Cindy?
No.
All right. I want to get this lady in quickly, and Mr. Constant, Mr. Peterson.
Okay, Linda Chase. My name is Linda Chase.
Yep.
First of all, I wanted to thank the APD and the Chief Dahl for the response at Denali School this morning. That's pretty scary. And then I'd like to suggest to anyone on the assembly or with the administration, a lot of questions are coming out here that regarding the police, that you could get a very informed, upfront, person-to-person answer by attending the APD Citizen Academy. It's free. It is a fantastic program, and you get to know some of the officers from every single department in the police. And it's one of the best things that I've done as far as learning about my city. I would suggest that you might consider it. And then finally, I want to ask each assembly member here, as well as any administration people that are still in the room, do we need to increase resources for abatement and thus be able to make a more serious, direct effort in abating these encampments where there are crimes being committed, where there is sexual assault? Look at any of the women that are in these encampments. Just go take a look at the women.
Thank you.
So I'd like to ask, who believes we should have an increase in resources for abatement?
Great. Mr. Constant.
Thank you, Chief. I just wanted to also thank you, like Ms. Chase did, and like at the beginning, Mr. Rivera did about the school. That was 4 blocks from my house, and I just moved out of. And I was there before you were because I was at my neighbor's house. And the response was incredible. The volume of presence was immediate. And in fact, Monday night, in a separate incident, I was going to dinner at Beartooth, and there was something that happened with a guy on a bike. Looked like they stopped a bike thief, and within 30 seconds there were 8 cruisers there, and it was unbelievable, swift response. So I just want to say thank you to your team for being on point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm continually getting calls, people have questions about some crime that might have been committed. And I'm constantly telling them, well, you know, call 311. And there's still a lot of people out there that aren't aware of the 311 number. And so do we have public service announcements that are coming up to publicize that number, get that out there so we don't have quite as many calling 911?
Great question. So we did a pretty significant amount of I guess, PR surrounding 311, but if it seems like people still aren't aware of it, we can definitely do another round, and I'll bring that up with our community relations staff later today, and we can get it out there again. I will say one thing that I did not anticipate that will message a little bit more strongly is that people assumed that 311 would somehow bypass the wait to get into dispatch, and I did not anticipate that people would hear that when we said call 311 to get to dispatch. So we'll make that a little bit more clear. There's only one group of people in the dispatch center, and I think probably most of you have seen it at one point or another. And they're answering 911 calls and 311, and then normal admin line calls, which is the same as 311. Anyway, so 911's obviously the priority, but we can definitely put that out.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments from the assembly, staff? Anybody from the audience? Thank you all for coming. If you have any suggestions for future subjects we should cover and carry, let us know. Thanks, Chief, and to your staff.